today I will cover a number of issues or a number of items, a number of images related to using Silver Efex Pro to make them black and white. And I want to talk about the aspect of what's important about that in the sense of someone recently, early today said, well, what about a color image? How do you know what works, what doesn't work, so on? Well, you never really know, but the aspect of it is that which one has more impact when it hits the screen. When I say that, I often think about I'm submitting this to a gallery or I'm submitting it to a competition. And how would that look the minute it comes up on the screen for them to see? Because when they are judging hundreds of images, they go very quickly through them, very quickly. It's less than a second that it's on the screen. So what is the impact on the screen? And then, for example, this image, this is not mine, but I brought it down from the web to demonstrate a number of things. One is, here's a very interesting color image. And when I took it into, and I have this in the flyer, when I took it into Silver Efex Pro, and I came up with two versions, and we're going to play a lot with the versions today because Silver Efex Pro gives you such a neat way to see different images. But let me put these here, and you see that color image, and then the one on the black and white on the left. That certainly shows all of the detail throughout the tree and even the leaves, but it doesn't have the same impact and depth as that color image has. And even when you look at the other black and white, which has more contrast and shows more of the image in the same way that the color image presents itself, and the black and white is done well, but it doesn't have the same emotional response from me as the color image has because of those beautiful yellow leaves and the soft blue tail part of the fog in the background. And all of that works so well in this color image. So is it something you should avoid? No. And is it a good black and white? Yes, but it's your personal choice at some point to say which one has a more of a personal feeling to you. The black and white here on the right, I think it's a very good black and white of that color image, but the color image has more of an appeal to me because of the feeling of the colors. And one of the things I talked about in the presentation last night was an image should have instant impact. So when it comes to the screen, and I don't just mean because of a competition, but even for yourself, when you're walking into the room and you have it on the wall, does it have that initial impact? And does it elicit an emotion? And in this case, the color image elicits the emotion more to me than the black and white on the right. Black on the right is very well done. All the detail needs to be there. It's good contrast level, but it doesn't elicit the emotion that this color image has for me. And this one is just overall too flat, but it does have a neat look to it. So it's a matter of preference on how you want to show a black and white. The other thing I talked about last week was that before you take an image from a color image into Silver Efex Pro or whatever software you use, make sure that that image, that color image, has all the enhancements that you need to do that makes it stand out. Don't take it into a black and white and then try to do the initial enhancements, because you will do other enhancements on a black and white. You may darken some areas more and so on. And in this case, as you know, I'm very particular about detail in the shadow areas. And on this one, I would open up, so I would use the dodge tool on midtones. Let me see if I have that. Yes, on midtones. And I would open up the shadow areas here a little bit more on this color image because I want the eye to be able to go into it. And Ansel's statement is anywhere in a shadow area where the viewer expects to see detail, there should be detail, including in the highlight areas. Anywhere that the viewer expects to see detail should be detail there. Now, a specular highlight from a white light bulb won't have detail. And if you're looking into the entrance of a mine or something, there may not be any detail. But if the viewer expects to see detail, then it should be there. And a very important thing about making an image black and white is that it has the detail in the shadow areas also. Very important aspect. I want to demonstrate one of these images that represents a subtlety of image related to the number of ways to present it. And this was in the flyer. This image, very striking color image. Some detail down in here, not in there. And if you heard me talk about black and white images or just overall images, Ansel said that if you're using a black area and no detail in it, if you're using it as an artistic aspect of the image, then it's fine not to have any detail in there, because the viewer's mind doesn't say, oh yeah, I should see in there. This stands out so well. So I thought, wow, interesting. Let's see how this works in Adobe Camera Raw. So I'll take that in there and explain a little bit more about Adobe Camera Raw. I mean, not Adobe Camera Raw, about Silver Efex Pro. The presets are on the left, and you can do selective presets up in the upper left. You can do modern, recently used, en vogue, all those. I simply, most cases, have all, click on all, so that I can scroll down and look at all the different presets. On the right-hand side are the various options related to what you can do to the image. And mostly, the global adjustments, brightness areas, and brightness is broken into the 4 categories: highlights, midtone, shadows, dynamic brightness, and contrast, also broken into 3 categories. And structure is the sharpness, so you can sharpen it even a little bit more than what's there. I won't go today into all the other areas because that's not the essence of today. Here's this image as it was brought in, and the preset is 000 neutral. Each of the presets are numbered. And one of my favorites is number 5, because it does a very good job in handling all the areas within an image. And in this case, because that foreground is pretty much without any detail, but if I wanted to see if there is detail in that shadow area, you can come over to the right-hand side, click on shadows, and move it to the right and see if anything appears. And geez, there is some aspect to that. Now, artistically, you see here on the left side, they're beginning to bring out some texture in the sand, but artistically, I prefer, and it's all personal, I prefer having that be very dark, because it pushes my eye right up until to the camels walking through the sand. Now the upper part here is a little bright. If I take this back into Photoshop, I would darken that a little bit to keep the eye coming down into the others. But I wanted to bring this one in to show you just playing with the different presets, how differently that presents this overall. And that may be a preferred way rather than this one. And there is no right or wrong about these. And I thought, that, look at this with the texture all throughout the sand. How neat that is. You could then take this into Photoshop, darken the camels a little more with a burn on shadows, and they would stand out. So interesting presentation. Come down to number 11. That handles that upper right area very differently, and the texture in through the highlights is handled more. You can come over and brighten those shadows a little bit from the right-hand side over here, brighten those up, brighten up the midtones, and even brighten up the highlights just a little bit more and keep that texture in there, but present this in a very different way. Very creative aspects of these different images. Here's number 15, another one of my favorites. Number 5 and number 15 are often used. I often use them. And here it has that little bit of, in the lower left corner, a little bit of that texture in the sand, and handles that upper portion in the upper right a little differently. And it keeps the main element of where the camels are located as the brightest area of the image. I want to come down to some others here just to show you. Here's using the dark as a very creative aspect. And you think about taking this back into Photoshop and maybe cropping from the top on down so that you are emphasizing the action of the camels and not having that upper part of the image. Very high key, or not high key, but bright, very bright. Rather interesting look to that. And it evens out the highlights up through the upper part. I think it's another very good presentation. As I was working with these the other day, kept coming into a number of them, it was more striking than the previous. Now this one has too much black for me, and that little highlights up in the upper right just don't work. Overall, it's just too much. So yeah, we'll look at those. Sepia tone didn't work for me, but it's all personal preference. But look at the different ways that you can present this one image because it has such a diversity of tone. I'll take this one and take it back into Photoshop so I show you what I was talking about on some of the highlight areas. Also, as you see, it's coming back in. Silver Efex Pro creates us another layer. The original color image is underneath it. Here's that layer. When I save these, if this was my image, it isn't, but if it was my image and I would go up to save as, when I do that, I would call it black and white and not overlay the original color image. And in that case, I don't need the color image to take up space in that image. So I would delete the color image and work, that duplicated it. Delete the color image, color layer, and keep only the black and white portion. And in this case, I would come over to the burn tool, put it on midtones at about 14%. Because when you burn, you want to do it a little bit at a time. One of the things I learned in the darkroom is don't try to darken everything right away, because then you can't back off and you have to start over. So I'll just darken this up in the upper corner and just doing the midtones. And you see there's some light rays up in there. And what I'm trying to do is darken that enough there so that you don't tend to go up to that upper part easily or quickly, that when it hits the screen, you are seeing this bottom part. Now, up in the upper left still has a little bit too much highlight in relation to the balance of the tones to the other part of the image. And in the upper right corner, same idea. You want to balance that tonal aspect of darkness. Now, look at how that looks so that your eye goes right to that lighter area. Here's the color image. Black and white, black and white. And notice how the darker area in the top pushes your eye down. And in this case, if I were to keep this black and white, I would probably crop just a little bit more off the top so that that bright area in the upper right wasn't so much. And that sweep of that line coming down, that highlight on the ridge, gives me a curve and a curve down here. So various ways to present an image of this magnitude. And this image has so much in it. Could also think about cropping this entirely in a way of presenting this image in a long horizontal. That works. Not as interesting as having all the other part of the image for the eye to roam around, but it certainly is an interesting aspect. So think about the presentation of your image. And I suggest that you do something, save it as a number 2, and then save another one, number 3, and wait a couple days and come back in and look at your images, and you'll see them differently than when you're working on them. We get so literally focused on a portion of the image, and we're not seeing the whole impact of the image as we're working on it. So let it sit a day or 2 and come back and look at
it. John, when you save your images in the PDF format, do you lose your history, or do you have to click a button? I notice there's a layers button, and you usually don't save, but when you save the PDF, then you had all that history when you come back 2 days later. Is it still there when you open that file
No, you
up?
don't. You do not have your history saved. No, you do not.
Okay. I was thinking I did something wrong, so
no.
that's a bummer.
So yeah, that was a good question. Also, I really never save an image. I only save a JPEG if it's something I'm. Anytime I save an image, I save it as a TIFF.
Yep.
And the reason is that the TIFF is a format that can be used by any software product out there. A PSD is particular to Photoshop data. That's what PSD means. And here's something interesting also, the JPEG versus a PNG. A PNG is a larger file and doesn't do as much compression as a JPEG does. So keep in mind that you don't want to be saving an image as a JPEG and then you intend to bring it back in again and use that to make a print or anything like that. Save the image that you want to make a print as a TIFF. Then you can also save it as a JPEG, and so that you have the quality of it.
When we're working on it, is it the best to just open and close or save it as the PSD file, and then when you're finished, save it as a TIFF?
Either way, the PSD and the TIFF are identical in the number of pixels. I just don't. Well, I have a PC, and if I use the File Explorer, it cannot show me a PSD. It'll show it as show that there's an image there, and it will have PSD in it. But if I have it as a TIFF, it shows me the image. So
yep. Sounds like a licensing issue with Microsoft.
Yeah, of course it is. And so everyone I do is a TIFF. This image of mine is from Yosemite, of course, that's El Capitan. And this, by the way, was a 4-shot panorama, horizontal shots done vertically. So the first one in the upper part, second part, third part, fourth part, and then put together and then enhanced. So I said, make sure that the image has everything the way you want it so that you can take it into Silver Efex Pro to turn it into a black and white. And you'll see how this image works. Again, here is just the neutral, which looks pretty good as it is. And I could make some adjustments over on the brightness side, bring down the highlights a little bit, and that will work nicely. So just bring those down a little, bring down some of the midtones. And that image is starting to work really nicely. My favorite, before I get there, here's number 2. That's just too bright overall. But you could say, oh, I just want to change the contrast. So my point is, play with the images and see how you like them. Don't lose detail, though. See how I'm moving that contrast? I'm losing detail in some of the shadow areas here in the trees. You don't want to do that. So if I come down to 5, see how it has maintained that wonderful detail that I've had in there. And I can even open those a little bit more on the right-hand side by moving that slider. And this is a good representation of that. I want to do a very bright one and then move some of the contrast, that's fine. But I think that this image for me was to have the darker one. And if I increase the sharpness, that even changes that look to that image. Here's number 6. Now the blacks are blocked up. The other one that I talked about was number 15. And it does give me a nice representation of this image. And I then have these sliders on the right-hand side. And if I do this structure a little bit, that is very nicely done. I'll bring this back into Photoshop. We'll compare. Creating the separate layer with the black and white. Here's the color image. Here's the black and white image. And you say, oh, yeah, that looks pretty good. Well, it does, but there are some things now in black and white that are extremely important to control the viewer's eye. And one of them is, even though on the color image, I have a little darker area down here in the foreground and along the top of the sky, when it was converted to the black and white, it's there, but not as strongly. So in this case, I would take the burn tool on midtones and just darken that lower left corner a little bit more to bring the viewer's eye into the center of the image and across the sky, up in there, and the tree, down here on the left a little bit more. They're up in the sky. Oh, got a little too much there. And in fact, it shows me that maybe my color image didn't have that sky handled very well to begin with. But I want to show you the effect of darkening the sky to bring the viewer's eye down into the image, the main part of the image, darkened on the right-hand side. So you think, oh, that was pretty good when it came in, John. Yes, it was. Let me show you these changes. Here's the color image. There's the black and white. Now watch the subtle changes of the burn tool to control the viewer's eye down into the image. Very subtle, but important in a black and white. Really brings the three-dimensionality of this out even more. I studied with a fellow in Chicago when I lived there. His name is Dan Anderson. His name is Dan Anderson, and he does workshops. But he is the one that taught me a lot about black and white. And this is one of his prints. And he has detail up in the clouds and all those areas. But he up in the upper left is pure black, but all the other aspects are there. And one of the things that struck me is how the foreground leads you into the image. So this was one of his, that was my training. One other one. He was very much a person that wanted detail in all the areas. And look at the contrast range of this image from the highlight area in this cathedral, the foreground area, but all the detail is there in every part of this. And the highlights in the center just jump out. The architecture stands out really well. He taught me how to think about metering a scene. Now, I was shooting film at the time, large format, with a handheld spot meter. So you would meter the darkest shadow area, then you'd meter the midtone area, then you'd meter the highlight area, and then the brightest area. And you would calculate the number of f-stops in between the shadow to the brightest and how you would set the exposure of the camera. Today we look at the histogram and it tells us. But that was what he taught me, and that just stuck in my head related to black and white so much, to show the detail and to show the subtleties of the change of highlights to shadows. Before I go to doing one with putting the sky in, I want to come to this one, and similar to that sand scene that we had, this is flat. There's not a lot of contrast. And maybe that's how the photographer would want it. I'll add just a little contrast to this and show you the difference of brightening this a little bit and then creating darker areas around it, and how much more that figure stands out from the background. Now, in this case, the upper part of the image is too bright for me because that's where my eye goes. And I would want to darken that before I do anything related to black and white. And so I darken that so that the eye is even more so coming down to where I want you to go and to have detail in those areas. And to darken that foreground a little bit. Let's take a look at just those changes. That's much more three-dimensional. Now, I will take this into Silver Efex Pro to do the black and white work. But that sky just isn't working for me for a color image. And probably I would go to cropping this to emphasize the subject and then take it into black and white. But let's take it in first and see what's going on with this image. Let me crop this here. So you want to do the enhancements on your black and white before you take it into convert it to black and white, and then select the different approach. No, that's way too dark. Too much contrast. Number 5, yes, that's nice contrast, but still that sky isn't working for me. And I can increase the contrast a little more here so that I fill in some of those shadow areas nicely. Liking that, I still think about doing the cropping. So not all images as you bring them in are going to do exactly what you want. So when you're thinking about the black and white versus a color, just sometimes the color image is going to be better. That's an interesting approach here. This number 11, let me try number 15 and then I'll come back to 11. Here's 14. Yeah, that doesn't work. 15, a little overall too bright. Do the contrast. Yeah, that works a little bit. I'll come back to number 11 to play with that one a little more. I like the texture that it's put into the shadow areas. So it's just a personal preference. So I'll bring that back into Photoshop. And in this case, be sure that I will want to crop it. Because even though it puts some texture in the sky, the emphasis is on the figure. So I want to do that even more in relation to how that looks. So like this, all this, but this bright area up in the left, we darken that a little bit more. Just to, got to get to the correct layer here. Get to have your eye go exactly where I want your eye to go. So darkening that and darkening the upper portion sky so that your eye isn't roaming around up there. Darken the overall foreground or background and that upper right corner, and then down the lower left to force the eye into the figure. So from here, very subtle changes there presents that differently. I want to show you a very interesting way of doing a mix of a color and a black and white image. The more that you learn Photoshop, the more that you will learn about layers.